Okay, let's do it.
Welcome, everyone, to Women of the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have Ashley here. We were looking to see when was she on the podcast, and it was episode 28, way back in the early days, which means I've known you for almost 6 years, which is wow, that's crazy that so much has happened in both our lives in those past 6 years. And I'm really excited because today Ashley is going to interview me because this is the final ish episode of Women of the Military podcast. We'll never know if it'll be the final episode, but I'm definitely going to take a break and figure out what's next. So I'm handing it over to you, Ashley. Take the reins, and now I get to jump into the interviewee seat.
Well, Amanda, thank you for asking. Of course, am much obliged. I have watched you grow, evolve, shift, pivot, all of the things, as we both have grown in the past, 6 years. Um, it's mind-boggling to me how time flies and the amazing work and things that you've accomplished. So I'm happy to do the role reversal today and interview you and all of the amazing things you've done. And I feel like for many of us who have listened to the podcast over the years, ask some of the questions that we want to know, like behind the scenes, the highlight reel, the moments where you, Amanda Huffman, were like, "This is surreal. I'm doing this, or I'm at this event, or I never would have thought. Here I am accepting XYZ award." Right? Like you're doing all of the things in amazing ways, and so I want to kick off our conversation today about the journey of the podcast. So let's look back. I know I was episode 28, but looking back at your first episode, what inspired you to start the Women of the Military podcast? Like what was the spark? What ignited that?
So in 2017, I did a series on deployments, and I was surprised because I asked all these people, men that I deployed with, and open calls on the internet, and I kept having women sign up and share their story about their deployment. And I was, first of all, blown away by like all the amazing things that women were doing in the military. And second of all, like really surprised that like all the guys that I asked, like, never responded, and so it was really interesting that through that series, I was like, "Oh, women, they're in the military." I was in the military, I should have known that, or I guess I did, but I hadn't really, like, thought about us being I guess I hadn't thought of us as a unique group because I guess I had always, like, not really thought about my gender, but then I had women who wanted to talk to me because I was a woman and I was sharing stories, and, so my initial focus was deployments, and then I shifted to women in the military because I was like, I don't care about deployments, I care about women. And so I was going to do the blog series again, but my husband's still in the military and we moved the summer of 2018 and I was really overwhelmed and it was supposed to go live in October and we moved in August and in September I was like I can't do this and my friend was like then don't do it. Like find some other way to share it. And so that was where the podcast idea came from, that discussion. And I was like, well, I have all these stories I've collected over the whole year of 2018 that I'll use if I have like, a week because I only had 28 stories. And so I was like, I need to find a way to like do week after week podcasts. So now I have 28 and then I'll just start interviewing people. And if there's a gap week where I can't find someone, then I'll take those stories. I didn't ever figure out how I was going to do it because I started the podcast, I started recording, and I never ran out of guests. And so I took those stories, I made the book, Women of the Military, and I released that in June, and the podcast started in January. So that was how it all started and where the idea came from.
Okay, that's how the yarn unraveled. It came from a blog series and then a pivot from a blog series, recognizing that during your time of service, deployments, cultivating again these stories, you found that women weren't like had the stories to share, but didn't have the platform to share it. And I know with your military experience, you're an officer, Air Force, civil engineer, correct? Got to make sure I get my Amanda Huffman facts correct, right? And it's very unique. And so, to your point, we come from this shared experience where we're doing the same work of our peers, men and women alike, and you it was a see a need, fill a need moment. And so, hearing the personal impact that it's had to a certain degree, can you expand on how hosting the podcast has impacted you personally or reshaped your perspective on service, storytelling, and or community?
That's a loaded question, but I think the main thing is I didn't realize how lonely I was as a veteran, and I didn't realize how detached from the military community I was. My husband was in the military, so I was like, I guess, sort of in the military community, but I also had a little bit of resentment towards the military that I hadn't addressed or even really knew was there. And I didn't know like why I felt the way I did. And then I started talking to other women and hearing their stories, and it resonated with me, like what they were experiencing. And then I talked to male veterans at like different conferences and other things and started hearing their stories, and it resonated with me. And so, like, I went from feeling like I failed leaving the military because I had all these emotions and challenges, and then realized that's like part of the veteran experience. And there's a lot of work being done today that wasn't being done in 2013 to help veterans. But I feel just being able to talk about my experience and then talk to other women and then male veterans too just really made me not feel so alone and so lost. And so I was able to like deal with all the emotions going on inside of me and then move forward and like start sharing it through blogging and freelance writing. And just it just was really healing, and like it brought me back into the veteran community.
Sounds like it brought you back into a space of creativity and, dare I say, femininity, like this piece of you that, allowed to be inspired and inspire others. I j
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah. And
it's
oh, go ahead.
no.
I was gonna say I've done a lot of work about the Enneagram, and I'm a four and like an individualist, and I like to be unique and different. And I think the military does a good job of like making you not be unique and different. And so it was also like figuring out how to be myself after being like kind of squashed down and having to conform and be like everyone else. And so I think the podcast gave me like an opportunity because I was doing something different. People talk a lot about women veterans now, but not 6 years ago. It's changed a lot, and there's still more work to do, but there's more like, there were no podcasts focused on women in the military, and now there's a handful of them. And it's just changed a lot, and it surprised me how popular it was and how much it resonated with people.
Absolutely. You are truly a trailblazer. You have set the groundwork for others, particularly as you are moving into new chapters. And I'm curious to hear about unexpected lessons. Were there any surprises or unexpected lessons you learned while interviewing guests or creating the podcast itself?
I think one of the lessons I learned was to be quiet and to listen. So I would, in the early days, now I'm using StreamYard, so I don't do it as much, but I would mute myself. So, like, for sound quality. And in the time it would take me to try and unmute myself, usually someone was just breathing and they weren't done talking. And then they would like tell this whole other, more interesting fact than they were going to say. And so it taught me how to listen more and to let my guests breathe and then keep talking. And so I think that was kind of the most interesting thing. Is sometimes I think even in conversations we're like so ready to like tell our answer or give someone advice, and maybe they're just trying to tell a story, and to listen and to not, quick be as quick to respond. So I think that was like the biggest lesson learned is that people have more to say. They might just be breathing.
Breathe, and 1 and 2 and 3. I think that's very sage advice. I do believe that many of us are always listening to reply, not listening to understand. And I do think, especially in the interviewing capacity, right, if you can ask better questions, like if you can get to the why, you can explain how. And sometimes you have to ask it 3 different times with a little bit of a pivot. And you'll be surprised, like people will open up as soon as you make that connection. And I'm sure that you have a highlight reel of a few of the stand out interviews that you have, or I say interviews and stories and or stories, right, that have deeply impacted you and or resonated with the audience. So can you share a few of those standout interviews or stories?
Well, I think, like, I could talk about, like, some of the generals that I got to interview, which was really cool, but it was really the people that I became friends with afterwards. I mean, like, Ashley and I became friends, and if you go back and listen to Ashley's interviews, she is like, I was, like, blown away with all you were doing and all you had accomplished, and you were, like, 25, I think. It was like, "What the heck is this girl doing? She's doing so much," and then to become friends with you and see you at conferences and, like, connect on LinkedIn and to be doing this, it's the relationships that I made. Tammy Bartlett is another person. She was, like, one of the first people on the podcast.
Mm.
I think she was before you. I think she was, like, 20, and she and I are still friends today, and just to watch, like, her journey on LinkedIn of, like, she didn't really know what she was doing. Now she's, like, at Student Veterans of America leading things and, being in Congress to sit on things, and, Marina Elias, I met her through Tammy, and now she's, like, this big wig, amazing lady, and I'm like, and she's my friend, and so it's, like, really cool to be able to connect. I'm mentioning, like, all DC people, but there's other people too, but those are, like, people off the top of my mind who really were there for me, in the early days and cheering me on and supporting me, and, 6 years later, we're still friends even though none of us live in the same place. Well, Tammy and you guys all still live in DC. I don't live there anymore, but we're still connected, and I know that there's like women out there who would help me in any situation that I needed that I can reach out to, and having that network is just amazing.
I think that's wonderful, and it's a super shout out to both Tammy and Maureen, who are also still dear friends of mine. And so many of the women who I would listen to, either previous episodes or after, somehow, way or shape, I would find or recognize in meet and greets. And I couldn't tell you how many women were like, "Oh my gosh, you heard the episode? Oh my gosh, you know my story?" And there's just a glow about them. And I think there's something to be said about the connections made. And even though DC is a very heavy network town, right? But it's not necessarily about, who you know, but who knows you. And to your point, like Maureen, Tammy, I've been growing with them as well. And so just to watch everyone grow these past 6 years has been a true pleasure. And so I think you're right on brand, on point for the stories and the connection and how that can bring other women veterans together. And I think that's truly what you set out to do with, the podcast. And I would say, mission accomplished, my friend, mission accomplished. Um, that being said, what has the response been from listeners that you've met over the years, right? We know a few people in our community. We kind of have that feedback loop, but what's it been like to interview folks who may not have had that voice before, or the listeners who didn't know they existed?
Yeah, so it's hard to pick like one story, but one person in particular, I interviewed her, and then after the interview was over, and like usually there's, a couple weeks or sometimes months between recording and when your episode goes live. And in that like window of time, she emailed me and was like, I don't think my story is valuable. I don't think that you should include it in the podcast. Like, you can just, throw it away because I'm not worthy to be on the podcast, which I had found her story really inspiring, and like I loved her story. And I was like, "No, your story matters. It's great. There's nothing like there's no reason to throw it away. We're going to still do it unless you like really if your fear is like I don't want this out on the internet, that's one thing, but it was more like, imposter syndrome. And so we ended up running the episode, and then a couple weeks later her mom emailed me and told me, I'm getting chills, about how impactful it was to see her daughter have her story shared, and how, it really gave her pride in her service. She had left the military early through force shaping, which she voluntarily separated, and I think she had a lot of guilt and shame about choosing that, and it was kind of like a healing process just to be able to share her story and to, like, honor the service that she had gone through, and not to be, like, I guess,
Mhm.
belittled because she had left before her service commitment. I was like, "No, you they needed people to leave. They asked people to leave, like, and it worked best for your family and your circumstances." And so, I got chills telling that story, and and all the other stories just went out my brain, but, I think that one is just really impactful and shows, like, the power of the story of, like, women sharing. From, like, the listener side, I think it's been interesting because randomly people will be like, "You're Amanda Huffman?" And I'll be like and then they'll be like, "That's so cool." And, like, I don't get a lot of, like, direct feedback, but some people will be like, "I know your voice because I just listen to you all the time." Or someone at the Military Influencer Conference was like, "You have a fan club." And I was like, "Really? Who are these people?" And so that's been kind of cool that people like the stories resonate and people like listening to my voice, which I never would have thought people would want to hear my voice over and over. But just am I making you cry, or am I telling too funny of stories?
A little bit. Just a little bit, my friend, just a little bit. I just I empathize, I understand just with that young lady's story you just shared because I know that that is reflective of far more women veterans than we're willing to admit, and just
Hmm.
the general experiences, and so I really resonate with that, and so and it's the most simplistic, breakdown, right? It's not about rank and title and position, right? But it's like that validating, self-exploring, and grace that we can extend to ourselves. Wow, you really got me good here, Amanda, oh my god. Gotta put the waterproof mascara on. Woo.
I
Anywho,
mean,
I didn't
isn't
mean to
that the
interrupt
like
you.
Isn't that the power of podcasting though? Like those stories, like something where she felt it wasn't good enough to share, and then like you didn't even listen to the episode. Maybe if you listen to the episode,
Yeah,
it'd be even
it's,
worse. But like, I think maybe that
mhm.
was like what stood out to me is like how much she felt shame in her service because she left early, or she didn't, she did deploy, so it wasn't like I didn't deploy. It was, which I've heard that a lot. Like my service doesn't really matter because I didn't deploy is another thing that I think a lot of women and men as well feel is like they didn't do enough. And so I think as veterans as a whole, we're just so hard on ourselves and think that we need to do more. And so, yeah. So, I mean, it's
Mhm.
just powerful stories.
Absolutely. I'm glad and honored to know you and to know that you've given a voice to so many who have needed it to move forward, and to evolve and to grow in their lives. We're all too familiar with folks who have remained in the same place and space, right? And so being able to speak your truth is important, but also like recognize your contributions. And that's something that's true for many military and I'd say almost military families, right? Is this just obligation to do more, but you've already done so much.
Mhm.
Um, and so with those elements in mind of growth and evolution, how has your interviewing style evolved since the first season? And I know you've touched on this just a little bit, but if I will, take my interview wrench and just throw it in there real quick about,
So I used to have, like,
again, kind of how you
question
have continued to grow in your com-
yeah.
yeah.
So
Oh, 100%.
I've had questions, like, hidden back up here or off to the side. I wasn't smart and didn't know to put them behind the camera before, but, so I would I would interview people, but I would, like, look on the internet and find out as much as I could before the interview about them so that I could, like, guess what type of questions to ask, and I think I learned pretty quickly that I needed to, like, just follow the story. Now I try and not know anything about people's stories because I don't want my bias to influence, like, what they're gonna talk about, and so now I just kind of let them tell their story, but I always start with, like, "Why did you decide to join the military?" And then based on that question, which is a really interesting question. It's kind of like an eye-opening question to see, how vulnerable people are gonna be for the interview. People don't know that the first question of, like, "Why did you decide to join the military?" tells me as the interviewer, like, so many different things. Like, it'll tell if you have a military background from your family. It'll if you are very authentic with what you're sharing, that means that you'll go really deep. If it's more, like, high level, then you know that the interview is not gonna it's gonna be more, like, technical focused and instead of more emotionally driven, so I think I use that question as, like, my guiding point, and then, I follow the story wherever it goes.
I think that's wonderful. It's always nice to have a good guide on in your corner.
Hint,
I
hint.
tease. But that's true. That's an excellent question to gauge vulnerability, authenticity, how you wanna then lead the conversation because I you've I know you've seen it all. And so that's one of those unique things, that really, I think, sets apart each of your stories and the stories that you've gathered from all these women across the years. And so that being said, behind the scenes, most folks don't necessarily know all the work that goes into a podcast, let alone the pre-conversations or the post-conversations. And so I wanted to dive a little bit into any rituals or routines that have, like, kept you motivated through so many recordings and elaborate on some of the insides and outs 'cause people just don't know how the sausage is made.
I mean, it takes so much work to do the podcast. Everyone keeps, not everyone, a lot of people are like, "What's next?" And I was like, "I cannot even tell you what's next because I'm so busy because the podcast takes so much time and effort just to keep going. And then I have kids and a family and, I have other things going on, but it's like and each week, one thing that I have learned is to do batching, which is something people always talk about, but if this was a normal interview, I guess and I probably will still do something, but after the interview is over, I'm gonna write up show notes, right now when it's fresh in my mind so that I don't have to do it. I'll have the image stuff done. I'll have everything done except for the editing process because I don't like editing. 'Cause it's so time consuming, but I can get all that done. But when I first started, I would do the interview, and then I would edit it, and as I was editing it, I would pause and then, like, write a summary and then pause, and it took forever, and so I've learned to, like, cut that part out, but, it just takes a lot of time, and then I use Calendly for my calendar, and I batch record and try and do it in, like, little month spans so that I have a break, but I don't know, it's just a lot of work. I don't feel like I gave you a lot of information, but it's a lot of work.
It sure is, and I think it's important for listeners, viewers to understand how much work goes into a podcast, right? It's not just having an interview. There's the pre-work, the post-work, that's the coordinating, getting folks online, also the editing. Oh, the I'm not a fan either. It's exhausting, and after a while, you think you're, like, hearing the same words, or like, "Wait a minute, is that the same question? Did wait." And then you, like, second guess, and you have to step back from it. I'm speaking from my own experiences here, not to distract, but preparing episodes, the amount of episodes you have done. So, to this point, how many episodes have been put out to the world?
Uh, I think this will be 308.
308. Wow. That's impressive. That's a lot of hours and time and consideration, not only respecting individual stories, but also it really shows the true dedication and inspiration, like, behind this baby. This is your baby in a way, right?
Yeah,
And so this is outstanding. Just outstanding work, Amanda. My goodness.
thank you.
I'm sitting over here, I'm like, "I'm not crying, you're crying." Um, so as we talk about 308 episodes, milestone episodes, I would love to know more about, with all the episodes under your belt, which ones have been the defining moments for the podcast in your opinion?
So I did an interview with Wilma Vaught in February of 2020, and she came to my house and sat at my kitchen table. And for one thing, it was like right before the pandemic, like we had no idea that the world was going to shut down. And her story was just so inspiring and impactful, and the fact that, like, she's not doing as well, and it's, like, one of the last interviews that she recorded, and so I think that is, like, really special, and I remember I was like, "There's a general sitting at my table," like, one of the first Air Force generals sitting at my kitchen table and having a conversation and getting to, she had notes that she had prepared, and she just, summoned wisdom, and, it was captured and able to be shared, and so that was really cool. And then, um, now I'm blanking. Why am I forgetting her name? She just passed away recently. She wrote Rock the Boat. Danelle, now I'm forgetting her last name, but she just passed away from a brain disease, and she wrote a really good book called Rock the Boat, and her interview is still one of the most popular episodes that people have listened to, and I don't really know why it was so popular, but it just has so many downloads, and that book is so good, and she died very quickly. I mean, she wasn't very old. She retired pretty recently, and like she wrote her story, and I think she thought she had many years, to share her story, and because she has written that book, she has her legacy written up in a book, and it's advice from her own life and the lessons she learned in the Navy and how she balanced being an admiral and, a mom. And so her story is really good. It's Danelle Barrett, right? I think that's her last. Anyways, but yeah, she just died in the last 2 or 3 months. And she was posting on social media about her deterioration, and then she was gone. And so, like, to capture her story is really, remarkable, and and it's sad because, like, women are dying, and so to be able to capture their stories before they do and have that legacy is just so important. And Kate Hendricks was also on the podcast. She died, I think 2 years ago from breast cancer, and she did so much research for military women, and uh, the PACT Act, her son was there because, a lot of work that she did was part of that. And so I guess, keeping our legacy and sharing the stories has been such an honor to be able to do that. And so those aren't like, that's not a very, I'm like not very happy today, but those are like, like when you think about like what does the podcast mean and why is it so important to share these stories, those are the things I think about because they don't get to share their story anymore, but it lives on the podcast.
Mm, absolutely. Was it retired Rear Admiral Danielle Barrett?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I know who you're talking about. Oh, yeah. As soon as you said it, I was like, that story resonates. I was like, I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah.
And yeah,
It's
that's
like
um those are powerful like legacy and significance and thinking about our place on earth is always this how do you balance the the inevitable, right? But also for
Mhm.
some individuals that is cut short and how important it is to leave your mark on this earth. And I'm so happy that you've been able to do that for some of these women that you've had the opportunity to capture their remarkable testimony of valor and their own truth and self acceptance and also just reflecting on resilience as a whole. I think as women veterans, it's a really core concept of like who we are and how. And again, I don't want to generalize, right? But like how we all move in this earth and space, and how we see ourselves when we put on different hats. And so, putting on the different hats or moving through different chapters of our lives are incredibly important. And so, um, like I said, I'm very honored that you would have asked me to help kind of cue you up for this new chapter and things that you are also working on in your continued legacy because you're also an author and you've contributed to other platforms with your abilities and time and it's been ever so appreciated and love to learn a little bit more of new ventures, things that you're working on that are reigniting and renewing you, Amanda, right? Outside of the podcast. Like what are you doing for you and what kind of new things are you looking forward to?
Yeah, I was like, right now I'm training for a marathon, which I regret signing up for. And it's been taking over my life. But I'll be almost at the end of training when this finally goes live, but still not have run the race. Um it's just like a lot. And then I'm really involved in my church mom. It's called Momco group, and so I'm helping lead. We have over 100 women, and that's been like a real challenge and exciting to be in a leadership role. And it's kind of given me a reminder that like leading an organization and running moving parts really is something that excites me and energizes me. And so I think I had a lot of, like, self-doubt because 'cause I've been a solopreneur for so long. I was like, "I can't work with people. I can't run things." And then I was like, "Oh, I can do this, and I am good at it." So, I don't really know, like, what's next in the pipeline, but, I do know that I have my GI Bill, and so part of the reason that I'm closing down the podcast is so I have more space to figure out what I should do for my degree and what to do to get my master's. And so that's one thing that I'm hoping to do in the next 2 to 3 years. I have the forever GI Bill, so I have time to figure it out. But the more I look into it, I realize that there needs to be like actual thought and time spent figuring out what I want to do and then like where I want to go to school and then how to use my GI Bill benefits. So I'm in the process of figuring out like where I want to go to school and what I want to do, and then what am I going to do after I graduate.
I know a person. I know a person who can float some ideas with.
Really, you do?
Oh goodness. What? No. I'm here for you. I got you. But even with gosh, I would say uncertainty is okay. It's okay to not know. And I think That's a really clear crystal message for listeners and viewers, right? Like, it's okay not to know what's next, and it's okay to close certain chapters and move on to the next, right? Like, who knows? Like, you could be reading a series and you just needed to finish that last chapter on this book to start a whole new adventure. And it's still the saga of you and you're writing every day because Amanda, you're main character energy, and we know this. And so if you decide you're going to go to school and do whatever the path lays ahead, like I said, I know someone, but also you're in good hands. Like, things have a way of working themselves out too. So these are all good things. I'm so excited for you. This is
Thank
excellent.
you. Thank you.
Of course. Of course. And so I want to wrap up just a little bit here. And I know it's like, oh, like I want to keep going and I have so many questions. I am a questions gal. I seek clarity and I would love to know, as you're shifting gears, entering new chapters, what advice do you have for those who want to start their own podcast, share their stories, and what do you expect, or pause, better question. What would be your advice for yourself, given that you've listened to so many different stories and journeys? What kind of grace can you extend to yourself, and for our listeners and viewers, right? About what the podcast has done for you and how sharing stories is so important.
I think realize like coming into it with like an open mind. I thought I knew a lot about women in the military. I don't know why. I had no like real I mean, I was a woman in the military, but that was like the end of my experience. And when I look back at my military education, it did not include women. And so being open to like learn about what others have done and like what others have experienced, and then the history and legacy that goes along with women. I think we did a series with someone, you and I were both in it, and it was, like, about the history of women in the military. It was a long time ago, and, like, the first one was, like, "Women in the military for 100 years," and I was like, "What the heck is that even about?" And it was, like, so fascinating to learn, like, the history of women and how, like, 100 years really wasn't far enough because women had been contributing for far longer, but their stories weren't being told. And I think
Mm.
that's the part that's, like, been the most interesting to me, is to hear the legacy of, like, what women had to go through to get us to where we are today, and, like, what I experienced and how that helped move the needle forward so that women can be in all combat roles, and, like, how women of today's generation are standing up and saying, like, "It's not right to be treated the way that we are," and they're pushing for change in a way that my generation was too afraid to ever say anything because we were just happy to be at the table, and now they're like, "That's not good enough." And so I think the legacy of, like, women in the military and the history of women, and then the future of, like, what is coming has been the part that's been so impactful. So I've learned so much, and I'm always thinking, "Oh, I don't think it anymore," because now I know. I'm like, "I know so much, there's nothing new to learn," and then the next day I'll find out something new. So now I know that, like, there's more stories to uncover and there's more, out there to learn about. And so I'm always reading and learning. And just because I'm not podcasting, it's hard to step away from podcasting because I do love it. And I do love hearing the stories. But yeah, I'm ready for a change, and it's not the only way that I can get the information. Like, I can read more books by women veterans, and um, there's other opportunities out there. So just being open to learn. I mean, my strength finder number 2 is learning. So I guess that's not really a stretch for me, but that's That was what I learned that was really unexpected. I thought it'd be, like, the technical aspect of, like, how do you make a podcast work, but all you really need is Google and YouTube, and you can figure it out.
Oh, like most things, right? Just Google it. We'll just figure it out. And I think that's very much so in a military, like, unofficial motto. Like, I'll figure it
Yeah,
out. What? Oh, you need it like yesterday with no resources? Also, I have no personnel, or oh, this isn't even got it, done. Figure it out, right? Um,
yeah. Yeah,
I
that's like
really
I just
enjoy that
started.
you've impressed upon.
Oh, I was gonna say I just started an embroidery project and someone was like, "How did you learn how to do that?" I was like, "I just YouTube the stitch, I watch someone do it, and then I try it. And then if it doesn't work, no who cares? No one will know that it's wrong." That's the military way.
Very true, very true. It's very much so. I will watch me figure it out as we go. We just make stuff happen, just as you've made this podcast happen and all these stories come to life. And I think it's so important to hit on the lifelong learner aspect. If it's any consolation, that is my number 2 Clifton strength is learner. Or no, I'm sorry, is number 1, and number 2 is strategic. So, yay. As we grow, right? We don't think how our experience shape us, but after a while, I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? That continue to learn, seek out stories, be curious, be inclusive in our storytelling and who we bring to the table. I've known a lot of women who have had to bring their chairs to the table, and now we have a seat. It's important that we speak just as much as we listen. And we've been listening for a long time. So, my advice to everyone listening today is to continue to listen and share Amanda Huffman's work, her legacy. Continue to share your stories on different mediums and platforms. Encourage you to be creative and curious. And we look forward to seeing what you do next, Amanda. And I want to say thank you so much for everything you have done. And I'm sure there will be lots of applauses and loves and all the things as we drop this episode. But for those listening, Amanda has been an absolute trailblazer in the military connected community. She has been a focal point for storytelling and someone who is and will continue to impact others and inspire. So I want to say thank you, Amanda, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today. And we look forward to watching and seeing what's next.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this episode. It really means a lot to me that I can look back at my time
Of
doing Women of the
course.
Military yeah, doing Women of the Military podcast and just get to, I guess, reminisce and think about like what it means to me. And it's exciting and scary to close this book, but I'm really excited about what's going to come next. So thanks everyone for watching, and thanks again, Ashley, for
Of
being the
course.
host.